They crossed the Atlantic not as conquerors but as cargo. Deep in the steel bellies of Liberty ships, men once dressed in crisp uniforms now lay packed like crates, reeking of salt, sweat, and defeat. The ocean churned beneath them, and the air inside the hold carried the sour weight of seasickness and unspoken fear. These were soldiers stripped of rank, of purpose, of certainty. The war had consumed everything they had once believed unshakable. Their comrades, their homes, their illusions of victory. All that remained was the silence between waves and the rattle of the ship as it carried them toward an unknown enemy shore. Each day of the voyage stretched like a lifetime. The darkness of the hold was broken only by slivers of light seeping through narrow vents. Men whispered to one another in the language of half-formed fears. Some imagined beatings and cages. Others swore they would never speak a word to their captors. They clung to propaganda like a lifeline, repeating stories of American cruelty, stories that made hatred easier than uncertainty. It was simpler to expect monsters than to face the hollow ache of not knowing. When at last the ships groaned into port, the prisoners were herded up onto the deck, blinking at the sharp daylight. The harbor stretched before them, foreign, industrial, unnervingly clean. Trucks waited like silent beasts along the docks. No soldiers barked threats. No weapons were raised. Only the steady, methodical voice of military police instructing them to move in lines. The calmness unsettled them more than shouting ever could. The convoy rumbled inland for hours, passing through neat towns with white fences and tidy streets. The men stared through barred truck windows at women carrying groceries, children playing, ordinary lives continuing as if the war were distant thunder. For soldiers raised in the roar of collapsing cities, the quiet order of these landscapes felt surreal. One man murmured, "They don't even look afraid." Another laughed under his breath, sharp and bitter, convinced it was all a facade. When the trucks finally stopped, they braced for the worst. The camp beyond the gates wasn't what they had imagined. Wooden barracks stood in straight, disciplined rows. Fences rose not like claws, but like boundaries drawn with a ruler. There were no snarling dogs, no mud pits, no chains. Instead, there were tidy walkways, organized compounds, and guard towers whose soldiers watched without shouting. The prisoners filed through the gate, expecting humiliation, punishment, or perhaps some performance of power. What they found was silence and order. Inside, they were assigned bunks, clean bunks, mattresses that didn't stink of rot, blankets that hadn't been scavenged from ruins. The canteens served meals that, though simple, were warm and far better than the watery rations of their last months under the Reich. Some ate in silence, as if waiting for the food to turn to ash in their mouths. Others laughed nervously, a sound somewhere between relief and suspicion. A few refused to touch their plates, convinced this was merely the calm before cruelty. As dusk settled over the camp, the men gathered in the barracks, each lost in his own private storm. The journey across the ocean had stripped away everything familiar, and now even their enemies' kindness felt like a trap. For years, they had been taught that Americans were ruthless beasts, decadent, weak, but merciless. And yet here they stood, warm, fed, and alive. That contradiction carved fissures into their certainty. Among them were veterans who had marched through fire and believed nothing could shake them. They kept their backs straight, their faces blank, whispering warnings to the younger men. "Don't trust this. It's bait." The younger soldiers, farm boys and students turned into soldiers overnight, stared at the barracks like lost children seeing a strange home. They wanted to believe the comfort wasn't a trick, but war had taught them never to believe in mercy. That night the camp hummed with uneasy quiet. Outside, guards smoked and talked softly among themselves. Inside, prisoners lay awake, listening to the sound of unfamiliar silence. No bombs, no planes, no orders screamed in the dark. The absence of fear was almost unbearable. One prisoner, a mechanic from Hamburg, stared at the ceiling and thought of his wife. He had imagined he'd be thrown into a pit, not a bed. He did not know whether to feel relief or dread. Another, barely 20, ran his fingers across the coarse blanket, whispering, "Why would they give us this?" No one had an answer. The strangeness of mercy unsettled them more than hatred ever could. Hatred had been their armor, but this quiet, structured, almost banal treatment forced them to feel something far more dangerous: doubt. As the lights dimmed, the men drifted into a restless sleep. The journey to America had ended, but something far more complex had begun. It was not the cruelty of captivity that would shape their days ahead, but the slow, disorienting discovery that their enemy was not what they had been taught to fear. In the darkness of that first night, between the creak of wooden bunks and the quiet breathing of hundreds of men. A question settled heavily in their chests. What if everything they had believed about the enemy was a lie? Morning arrived in the camp without sirens. A pale mist hung over the fence line as guards moved through the rows with their usual unnervingly calm precision. No shouting, no kicks. Just the dull rhythm of boots on gravel. The prisoners gathered in the yard, lined up without needing orders. War had trained them to stand in lines. An American officer climbed onto a wooden platform at the edge of the square. He wasn't young, but carried himself with the ease of a man who had not fought in the mud for years. His uniform was clean, his voice steady, nothing like the frantic barks they were used to. He spoke slowly, each word carefully measured. An interpreter stood beside him, translating into German with equal precision. "You will be allowed to write letters home." For a heartbeat, the words didn't land. The wind rustled through the fence. The prisoners blinked at each other, unsure they had heard correctly. Then a ripple spread through the crowd like a current through water. Some laughed, short and sharp. Others narrowed their eyes, searching for the catch. One man whispered, "They're mocking us." Another muttered, "It's a trick." For years, they had been told the enemy was inhuman. In Germany, letters were privileges, not rights. Even soldiers in the field clung to a single crumpled envelope as if it were proof that the world beyond the trenches still existed. And now, as prisoners, they were being told they could do what even free men sometimes couldn't. Reach home. The officer continued, his interpreter matching him word for word. "Twice a month, paper and envelopes will be provided. Your letters will be checked for military information. After that, they will be sent through the Red Cross to your families." The Red Cross. That name carried weight even among men raised on propaganda. It was supposed to mean neutrality, humanity, something beyond war. Yet belief didn't come easily. They had lived too long in a world where mercy was just another weapon. A few men glanced at the sky as if expecting laughter from some hidden loudspeaker. Others stared at their boots, afraid to hope. A young soldier clenched his fists at his sides, torn between yearning and suspicion. He thought of his mother in Cologne, unsure if she was even still alive. If this was true, if his words could cross the ocean, then she would know. But what if they twisted his message? What if his letter became someone else's propaganda? That afternoon, an interpreter walked through the barracks, explaining the rules with bureaucratic calm. Letters could only be sent to family. No military details. No maps, no escape plans. No politics. If rules were broken, the sentences would be crossed out or the letter destroyed. The words were plain and measured, but the prisoners heard something else beneath them. Possibility. The announcement fractured the camp into quiet factions. Hardened veterans dismissed it outright. "They want to make us soft," a sergeant hissed in the dim barracks. "You'll see. It's all part of their plan." But the younger ones, who had barely grown into their uniforms before being captured, held on to the idea like a fragile ember. Even the chance to send a single word across the ocean was enough to unsettle their walls of cynicism. That night, the camp buzzed not with fear, but with an unfamiliar energy. The promise of letters seeped into conversations in every corner. Men who hadn't spoken in days exchanged cautious guesses about whether their towns still stood, whether their families were alive, whether the letters would truly reach them. Some didn't dare to hope aloud, afraid to break the spell. A farmer from Bavaria whispered to his bunkmate, "If I write to my wife, will she even receive it? Will she believe it's me?" His voice cracked at the word wife, a word he hadn't said aloud since capture. Another man, once a teacher, leaned back against the wall, skeptical but thoughtful. "If this is propaganda, it's the strangest kind I've ever seen," he muttered. The next morning brought confirmation. Sheets of pale, official stationery stamped with the Red Cross emblem were shown during roll call. Not yet distributed, just displayed. The sight alone sent a shiver through the ranks. Tangible proof. Not rumor, not a cruel joke. Paper, envelopes, a way out of the silence. One guard, a tall man with tired eyes, spoke to a prisoner in broken German as he passed by. "Letters real," he said, patting the air to calm. "You write." Family read. It was clumsy, but the sincerity in his voice was disarming. The prisoner stared at him, caught off guard. It was the first time he'd heard an American speak not as a warden, but as a man. Even so, doubt clung to the edges of hope like frost. Some whispered that the letters would never leave the camp, that the Red Cross was just a cover. Others swore it was all a way to make them forget they were prisoners. But underneath the fear, something fragile began to take shape. The thought of connection. The idea that their existence could still be known beyond the wire. That evening, as lights dimmed and the camp settled into uneasy quiet, one young man sat on his bunk. staring at the blank wall as though it might answer him. He imagined his mother opening an envelope with his handwriting on it. He pictured her crying, not because he was home, but because she would know he was alive. That thought alone was enough to make his chest ache. For the first time since capture, hope slipped in, uninvited and dangerous. Not a triumphant hope, not the kind of roaring confidence they'd been taught to mimic in propaganda posters. This was quieter, a spark in a damp forest, easily smothered, but real. Outside, guards paced with rifles slung over their shoulders, indifferent to the quiet storm building inside the barracks. The prisoners lay in their bunks with eyes wide open, minds racing faster than their tired bodies could follow. For some, this was a trap. For others, it was salvation. For all of them, it was a beginning. They had crossed an ocean expecting only chains. Now, the idea of a letter, a single sheet of paper, had cracked the armor of hatred they'd been wrapped in for years. And though no ink had yet touched the page, the war inside their minds had already begun to shift. The morning they called writing day broke clear and cold. Frost clung to the fence wires like thin strands of glass, and the breath of hundreds of men fogged the air as they gathered in formation. No one said much. The announcement had been repeated through the camp the night before. Each man would receive a single sheet of paper and an envelope, 2 letters and 4 postcards each month. Every word read, censored for secrets. Every line a risk and a lifeline. Inside the mess hall, rows of tables had been cleared. Guards and clerks moved like clockwork, setting down thin pencils and crisp Red Cross stationery. The emblem stamped at the top of the page seemed almost absurdly elegant compared to the rough wood beneath it. When the prisoners were finally ushered in, a hush fell over the room. Hundreds of eyes fixed on stacks of blank paper, as if staring at something dangerous. A young interpreter with round spectacles stood on a makeshift platform, his German crisp. No politics, no details of troop movements, no camp descriptions. Only family matters, he recited. Write clearly, addressed to immediate family only. If you break the rules, the letter is destroyed. His voice was steady but almost kind, which made it harder to distrust. The men lined up one by one. Each received a pencil, a sheet, an envelope with the camp's return address already printed. For many, the feel of that thin paper between their fingers was more unsettling than the sound of artillery had ever been. It was a door, but they had no idea what waited on the other side. When the first wave of prisoners sat down, silence deepened. Not the silence of fear, but the fragile kind that falls before someone speaks a truth they've been avoiding. For years they had lived with commands, slogans, and shouted orders. Now the only voice they heard was their own heartbeat. A Bavarian farm boy stared at the page until his knuckles turned white. He whispered to himself, "What do I even say?" Across from him, a veteran sergeant gripped his pencil like a weapon and muttered, "Don't give them anything real." The younger man nodded, but his hands trembled anyway. Then came the first tentative scratches of graphite. A single letter written, then a word, then a line. The sound multiplied, filling the room with a soft, persistent rustling. To anyone listening from outside, it might have sounded ordinary. Inside, it was a battlefield of another kind. For some, the first line was easy, "I am alive." For others, it was agony. One man from Dresden froze for nearly 20 minutes before daring to write the name of his wife. He had no idea whether she still had a home to receive this letter, or whether his words would arrive at nothing but rubble. Around the room, the range of emotions was raw and visible. A teacher, once eloquent, could barely put 2 sentences together. A student who had marched into war dreaming of glory now stared at his trembling hand, realizing that this, not a bullet, not a victory speech, might be the most important thing he ever wrote. The censors waited quietly at the edges of the hall, black pencils ready. Lines would be struck through anything forbidden. Everyone knew it. That knowledge hung over them like a blade. Even the simplest sentences felt dangerous. Could an innocent phrase be misunderstood? Could a careless word bring harm to someone back home? Fear made their sentences smaller, flatter. But still, they wrote. Some resorted to safe formulas. "I am healthy. I am treated well. Do not worry." Words stripped bare of emotion, but heavy with meaning to those who would read them. Others, more daring, tucked fragments of memory between the lines. A mention of the apple tree by the house, the sound of the church bell on Sundays, a family dog's name, tiny smuggled pieces of their former lives. The young man from Cologne bit his lip hard enough to draw blood as he wrote, "Dear Mother." The word mother alone felt like stepping onto thin ice. He could almost see her, kneeling by the stove, listening for footsteps that would never come. He didn't know if she still lived in their house, or if the house still stood. But for the first time since his capture, he was speaking to her. In one corner of the room, a man broke his pencil clean in half, not out of anger, but from how hard he'd been gripping it. Another sat with his head in his hands, unable to find a single word. A sergeant leaned over and muttered, "Better silence than a mistake." But silence, too, was a kind of wound. Hours passed, though few noticed. Guards moved quietly, collecting finished envelopes. They did not leer or threaten. They simply stacked the papers like bureaucrats processing a mundane task. But to the men who had written those letters, nothing about it felt mundane. Every folded sheet held a heartbeat. When the last letters were gathered, the interpreters and officers began to review them. The prisoners watched every movement of their hands. Black lines slashed through a handful of sentences, nothing more. Most words were left untouched. That shocked the men more than any deletion could have. If the Americans wanted to twist their words, why leave so much untouched? When the sacks of letters were carried away, a strange quiet lingered. No celebration, no cheer. Just the collective exhale of hundreds of men who had touched something fragile inside themselves. A hope they hadn't dared admit was still there. That night, in the barracks, they spoke in whispers. About wives and mothers. About children they might never meet. About what they had written and what they'd left unsaid. Some men clutched their Red Cross stationery envelope as if it were a medal. Others stared at their hands, as though they had just signed something they didn't fully understand. No one knew if the letters would ever reach their families. But something undeniable had shifted. For the first time, their existence inside the camp was not a sealed silence. Their words were in motion. Somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the ocean, their lives had stretched outward again. It was a quiet rebellion, not of guns, not of force, but of words. The letters left the camp quietly, without ceremony. Sacks were stacked at the edge of the yard, tied tight with twine and tagged with numbers. Trucks rolled up before dawn, engines purring in the chill air. A few prisoners pressed their foreheads against the barrack windows, straining to catch a glimpse as the canvas-covered vehicles pulled away. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires seemed to echo far longer than it should have. No announcements were made, no promises, just a quiet, bureaucratic departure, as though the most fragile hopes of hundreds of men were nothing more than paperwork in motion. Rumors began within hours. Some swore the sacks were driven straight to New York or Boston, loaded onto ships bound for neutral shores. Others claimed they never left the camp, that it was all theater meant to soften prisoners. A few men, too proud or too afraid to hope, muttered that the letters were probably being burned before the trucks even reached the main road. But beneath the layers of cynicism, something else pulsed. A tremor of belief. The fact that the letters had been carried away at all was enough to keep that spark alive. One guard, a young corporal with soft eyes, was asked by a prisoner in halting English, "Where they go?" The guard didn't shrug, didn't smirk. He simply replied, "They travel. Be patient." It wasn't much, but for men who had been living in silence, those words felt like proof. Weeks earlier, these same men had crossed the Atlantic as captives, believing the enemy to be monstrous. Now their own words were making the reverse journey, borne on trains, ships, and the goodwill of a neutral organization. It was almost too strange to accept. Through whispers and fragments of overheard conversations, the prisoners pieced together the route. First, the letters were screened again at military postal centers in the United States. There, censors with steady hands checked for codes or secrets that might hide between the lines. Then the letters were handed over to the International Red Cross, the emblem that had hovered on their paper now becoming their passage across borders. From there, the path split like a river into many channels. Some mail went through Switzerland, some through Sweden. A few shipments reportedly traveled through Lisbon, riding railways across Europe to slip into Germany's battered postal system. The journey could take weeks, sometimes months, but it was real, or so the rumors said. Inside the camp, the waiting became its own kind of captivity. Men sat on their bunks in the evenings, staring at the darkness, wondering where their letters were at that very moment. Were they on a ship crossing storm-tossed water, sitting in some office stacked with thousands of envelopes? Or already in the hands of a mother in Dresden or a wife in Munich, her tears staining the paper? Some men clung to their skepticism as if it were armor. A lieutenant scoffed, "The Red Cross is just a mask. It's all propaganda. They'll use your words against you." But others countered softly, "Then why let us write it all?" No one had a satisfying answer. Even the most cynical couldn't deny the details that began to surface. A guard let slip that a shipment had reached the coast. Another prisoner who understood English overheard a clerk mention Geneva. Each fragment was like a drop of water on parched soil. small but enough to make something grow. At night, as the camp settled into its slow rhythm, the men imagined their words moving, not as ink on paper, but as living things, traveling far beyond the barbed wire. A soldier from Bremen pictured his letter passing through a chain of hands, making its way through checkpoints, sorting rooms, and finally landing in the cracked letterbox of a street he hadn't seen in years. Another saw his words floating over the ocean, carried by the same waters that had once delivered him here in chains. This waiting was different from the silence of captivity. It wasn't the heavy weight of despair, but something far more dangerous, fragile hope, the kind that grows quietly in the shadows, impossible to fully kill. The logistics of the mail became a daily topic, more persistent than talk of war news or rations. Men speculated about timelines, debated which ports were safer, even argued about which neutral countries were most reliable. It didn't matter whether the guesses were right. The act of imagining the journey itself gave them something to hold on to. One night, as the barracks dimmed, a young man whispered to his bunkmate, "Do you think she'll recognize my handwriting?" The other man didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both stared at the ceiling in silence, their thoughts traveling across an ocean. The Americans watched all this with quiet detachment. To them, the mail was procedure, a system, a line item on a list. But they noticed the change in the prisoners. Fewer fights, less shouting. Men spoke to each other more. Even the most hardened faces softened when talk of letters arose. It was as if the act of writing had given their captivity a direction, a thread stretching outward, pulling their minds away from the fences. Days blurred into weeks. The trucks came and went, collecting fresh bundles. The prisoners waited, suspended in time. Their bodies were still here, behind the wire, but their words were out there, moving through the world they had lost. And though no reply had yet returned, the silence itself felt different now. It was no longer a dead end. It was a pause filled with the possibility that someone, somewhere, might be waiting too. The day began like any other. Gray sky, cold air, boots crunching against gravel, prisoners lined up out of habit, their faces carved with the tired stillness of men who had learned not to expect anything. Then a ripple passed down the line. It started at the far end of the camp, a low murmur that gathered weight as it moved. Trucks had arrived, not with food, not with guards, but with mailbags. Sacks were carried through the gates like precious cargo. Red Cross seals glinted faintly in the pale light. Soldiers held clipboards, reading names from long lists. At first, no one dared to believe it. For weeks, they had watched their letters disappear into trucks and vanish into rumor. Now the world was sending something back. The names began, one by one, halting, careful, foreign tongues bending over German syllables. Each name was a spark, each envelope a small explosion of possibility. Men craned their necks, stood on tiptoe, gripped the sleeves of those in front of them. The air, usually heavy and stagnant, quivered like a live wire. The first letters were handed out to trembling hands. For a heartbeat, no one opened anything. They just stared. Months of silence, of imagining and doubting, condensed into a scrap of paper sealed in an envelope. One soldier from Hamburg clutched his to his chest, as if afraid it would dissolve. A boy from Cologne pressed his face into his hands, the corners of the letter digging into his forehead like proof he wasn't dreaming. Then the sound came. A tearing flap, paper sliding free, and with it, everything broke open. Laughter and sobs mingled in the same air. Some men collapsed onto bunks, clutching the pages as if they were the last piece of their former lives. Others read aloud in shaking voices, stumbling over familiar handwriting. One man traced each line with his fingertips, whispering the name of his wife over and over as though speaking it might summon her to him. A letter written in a cramped, rushed scrawl told one prisoner his father was still alive after a bombing. Another letter brought news of a child born while its father crossed the ocean in chains. A third, a single delicate page, told of a home reduced to rubble. The reactions were unpredictable, raw. Joy cracked into tears, and grief folded into stunned laughter. Men who hadn't spoken in weeks hugged, shouted, cursed, or sat silently with wet eyes. A sergeant who had scoffed at the letter system for weeks opened his envelope last. Inside, a single sentence in his wife's handwriting. "We are alive." He read it once, then again, and again. When his voice finally gave out, his hands did not let go of the paper. The camp was no longer silent. For the first time since their arrival, noise filled the air, human noise. Not the bark of orders, not the thud of boots, but the sound of lives reconnecting. Men recited lines aloud, letting their bunkmates hear fragments of their families. My mother still bakes bread. The roof survived the raids. They found my brother alive. She says she still waits. But not every letter carried hope. A man from Berlin unfolded a page with shaking hands, read 3 lines and fell to his knees. His father had died in an air raid. Another received news that his entire street had been erased. No house, no neighbors, no certainty anyone had survived. Grief burned through the barracks like a slow fire. Yet even the cruelest letters carried something powerful. The truth. No longer were they sealed off in a fog of not knowing. The world had answered them. For many, that was enough to change everything. That night, after the chaos settled, the barracks were a patchwork of flickering emotions. One corner was filled with laughter and whispered stories, another with silent weeping. Men who had once spoken only of war now spoke of gardens, bakeries, and kitchens. One soldier read about his newborn daughter again and again until his bunkmate could recite it by heart. Another held his letter so tightly the edges frayed. Even the guards noticed the change. They had seen the prisoner's eyes dulled by uncertainty. Now those same eyes burned with something fierce and fragile. Hope had weight. It sat on their chests, making it hard to breathe, but also keeping them alive. A single Red Cross envelope had done what no weapon could. It pierced the walls of captivity. The camp's routines remained the same. Roll call, work details. Lights out. But beneath the structure, something invisible shifted. Men who had once walked with heads bowed now carried themselves differently, as though some unseen cord stretched across the ocean was pulling them upright. One guard, a quiet man from Ohio, leaned against a fence that evening and watched the barracks. Inside, dozens of prisoners sat beneath dim bulbs, reading and rereading their letters until the paper softened in their hands. "They're just words," he murmured to another soldier. But they both knew better. Words were everything. A teacher-turned-soldier whispered to his bunkmate, This is proof I still exist out there." Another man kissed the edge of his page, laughing through tears. The sound of it was raw and strange and human. As night deepened, many didn't sleep. They lay awake with their letters pressed against their chests, breathing as though trying to keep them alive. For months, they had imagined their words disappearing into the void. Now the void had spoken back. And for the first time since the war had swallowed their lives whole, they no longer felt like ghosts. The days after the first letters arrived carried a different kind of quiet. Not the cold silence of despair, but the gentle hum of men rediscovering the sound of their own lives. Something intangible had settled over the camp. A thread that connected the barracks to distant kitchens, ruined streets, and small towns across a wounded Germany. Morning roll calls still happened with mechanical precision. Work details marched to their assignments as they always had. Guards still paced the fences, rifles slung against their shoulders. But underneath the routine, everything felt changed. The air inside the barracks no longer pressed down with the same dead weight. Where once men had stared at their boots, they now whispered over their breakfast trays, trading fragments of stories they had read the night before. One father described his newborn daughter's first cry as told in his wife's letter. A teacher recited a line his mother had written about the apple tree surviving the winter frost. Someone laughed, not bitterly but softly, almost shyly, at a sibling's mischievous anecdote scribbled in messy handwriting. These were not the conversations of soldiers at war. They were the conversations of men remembering they were human. Even those who had received no letter found themselves drawn into the orbit of this fragile hope. They sat close to those who read aloud, closing their eyes and borrowing someone else's joy. One young soldier whispered after listening to another's letter, "It's like hearing my home too." And for a moment, it was. The guards noticed the difference as well. Fewer fights broke out. Tension between prisoners and sentries dulled at the edges. Men walked with less stiffness, as if something invisible had loosened the iron coils inside them. An American corporal, leaning on the fence one afternoon, muttered to a fellow guard, "It's like they're breathing again." Mail day became a ritual. The moment sacks appeared through the gates, a pulse of anticipation ran through the camp like a tremor. Men straightened their backs. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Names were called slowly, deliberately, each syllable carrying the weight of lives far beyond the wire. Some prisoners received letters every cycle. Others waited empty-handed, their disappointment folding quietly into their bunk. Yet even then, hope lingered, because the system was real, because one day their name might be called too. Evenings took on a rhythm of their own. Under the yellow glow of bare bulbs, men sat with their letters unfolded across their laps, reading until the ink smudged against their fingers. They read aloud to trusted friends, shared jokes scribbled in margins, wept quietly over news of births and deaths. The letters became artifacts, not just paper, but anchors to a world that hadn't entirely disappeared. For many, the words sparked a quiet rebellion against despair. A farmer who once moved like a ghost through the camp began whittling tiny wooden toys, imagining a day he might give them to the son he'd never met. A teacher began sketching plans for reopening a school after the war. Others traced escape routes not from the camp, but from hopelessness itself. Their minds drifted beyond fences, imagining futures that once seemed unthinkable. Some men began to carry their letters folded in their shirt pockets, close to their hearts. Others hid them in their boots, unwilling to let them out of reach even during work shifts. A few had received none, but crafted phantom letters in their minds anyway, whispering to imagined voices at night. The simple act of believing was enough to keep them from vanishing into silence. Among the older soldiers, suspicion remained, but it had softened. A lieutenant who had once snarled at the mention of American generosity now read a letter over and over, lips moving soundlessly. He didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. The tremor in his hands said enough. In subtle ways, the camp itself seemed to shift. Men polished their boots more. They cleaned their bunks with an attention that hadn't existed before. It wasn't pride in the camp. It was the quiet insistence that they were still part of a world worth returning to. For years, they had been told captivity would erase them. But now, through ink and paper, they had proof that their lives still existed beyond the fence. The war could take their freedom. It could bury their cities, but it hadn't silenced their names. A Bavarian soldier stared at a letter from his wife one evening, lips barely moving as he whispered the words again and again. She had written, "The apple tree is blooming again." It was nothing. It was everything. It was a piece of the world waiting for him. The Americans did not celebrate the effect their system had. To them, the mail was a procedural obligation, a line in a Geneva Convention manual. But they noticed. They saw the way prisoners lined up straighter, the way eyes brightened when names were called. Even their own watch rotations felt less tense. The camp had not turned soft. Barbed wire still ringed the perimeter. Orders were still orders. But within that wire, men had begun to remember themselves. Not as soldiers, not as enemies, but as sons, fathers, brothers, and husbands. Hope was no longer a rumor. It was folded in envelopes, tucked into boots, hidden beneath mattresses. It breathed with them at night, and that, more than anything else, changed the nature of their captivity. Not everyone let hope in. Even as letters became a rhythm, as steady as the roll calls and the boots on gravel, doubt held its ground in the corners of the camp. It lived in whispers after lights out, in hard stares during mail call, in the rigid posture of men who refused to unfold their envelopes in front of others. For some prisoners, each letter that arrived was not a bridge to the outside world, but a weapon they suspected had been sharpened by their captors. "They want us to trust them," a former officer muttered one night, his voice low and bitter. "And when we do, they'll use it. You'll see." His hands were clean and steady, like a man who still believed discipline could shield him from doubt. Around him, a few men nodded. Others stared at the floor, caught between the warmth they'd begun to feel and the old armor of suspicion they weren't yet ready to discard. Rumors returned like ghosts. That the Red Cross letters were being altered. That American intelligence was reading their words, twisting them to sow confusion. That no letter actually reached home. That they were all sitting in a warehouse somewhere, unread, feeding only their hopes so it could be weaponized later. None of these whispers were backed by evidence. They didn't need to be. In war, suspicion was as real as fact. A young soldier, once radiant with hope after receiving a letter from his sister, now avoided mail call altogether. He'd started to imagine that the next letter would bring news of a death. And it was easier to keep hope frozen than to risk shattering it. Another man who had received nothing for weeks began to spit the word letters like a curse. "It's all a trick," he'd say, his bitterness louder each time. But even the loudest doubt had a harder time taking root now. Too many envelopes had arrived. Too many stories had come through. Men recognized handwriting. They smelled the faint traces of home in the creases of paper. Perfume. Chimney smoke. Sometimes even the scent of stored linens. No forgery could have replicated that. The reality was undeniable. Their words had gone out, and words had come back. Still, ideological fault lines emerged. Around the campfire barrel in the evenings, two kinds of conversations unfolded. Some men spoke of what they would rebuild when they returned. Others clung to the language of the Reich, their pride bruised and smoldering. "It's a trick," the sergeant repeated one night, pacing like a caged dog. They feed us hope to make us soft. So when they ask something of us, we'll give it freely. A teacher, thin and quiet but with a steady voice, finally responded, or maybe they give it because they don't need to break us anymore. The sergeant turned, eyes flashing. And you believe that? I believe my mother wrote this, the teacher replied, lifting a worn letter from his pocket. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but with something stronger. I believe this is real, and that's enough for me. Silence followed. The fire cracked. Neither man convinced the other, but those listening felt the weight of the exchange settle over them. The war was far away now, but its echoes still dictated how they saw the world. Some prisoners turned to faith to bridge the gap between doubt and belief. Others turned inward, retreating into memory. A few tried to ignore it altogether, moving through their days with letters folded deep in their pockets, as if keeping hope close could protect it from scrutiny. The Americans, for their part, said nothing. They didn't need to. Their quiet efficiency, trucks arriving, mail sorted, envelopes distributed like clockwork, spoke louder than any speech. Each new letter was a silent blow against disbelief. Yet doubt didn't vanish. It rarely does. One night, as rain hammered against the barrack roof, a young soldier burned his letter in the corner stove. The flames ate the page quickly, curling the words into black ribbons. "Better ashes than lies," he muttered, even as tears cut through the soot on his cheeks. Across the room, another man carefully unfolded his own letter for the 100th time, tracing each line with reverence. "Better hope than nothing," he whispered. The camp became a place where both truths existed side by side. Doubt sat next to belief at mealtimes. Fear and hope shared bunks. The barbed wire outside had not changed, but the invisible fences inside the men were shifting, bending under the weight of letters and lived experience. As weeks turned into months, the whispers grew quieter. Not because they were silenced, but because reality made them harder to sustain. The mail kept coming. The handwriting kept arriving. The words kept connecting lives across an ocean. The prisoners still did not trust their captors. Not fully, not ever, but they trusted the paper in their hands, the ink that looped and curved in familiar ways, and that trust was something their captors could neither command nor control. In the long, uneasy quiet after lights out, men lay in their bunks with different truths. For some, the world outside the fence had become real again. For others, it remained a shadow. But either way, hope was no longer just a rumor. It had become an unshakable reality, not universal, not unanimous, but alive. And in war, something alive can outlast almost anything. When the guns finally fell silent and the war began to loosen its grip on the world, the letters did not vanish with the conflict. They remained, folded into coat pockets, hidden between ration books tucked beneath mattresses, wrapped carefully in cloth like fragile treasures. For the prisoners who had survived their captivity in America, these envelopes became the single most vivid artifact of their years behind barbed wire. The guards, the fences, the cold barracks, those memories blurred over time. But the feel of a paper envelope pressed against their palm, the familiar handwriting of someone they loved, the heartbeat that raced just before opening a letter, that stayed sharp. Many carried those pieces of paper home when they were finally released. Some arrived to find families waiting on the same doorsteps described in the letters. Others returned to ruins where only words had survived. In both cases, those letters were more than messages. They were proof that they had not disappeared. A former sergeant from Hamburg would later tell his grandson, "Before the letters, I felt like I had already died." A young Bavarian soldier, now an old man with shaking hands, would pull a crumpled note from a box and whisper, "This is how I found my way home." For some families, those letters were the only communication they'd received during the entire war. Mothers who had watched their sons marched off to the front clung to every word written in captivity. Wives read and reread those lines until they were memorized, folded so often the creases nearly tore the paper in two. Children who grew up without fathers kept the envelopes as talismans, proof that someone out there still thought of them, even in a place they could not imagine. The impact of those letters stretched far beyond their intended purpose. American officers may have seen them as a legal obligation, a procedural courtesy under international law. But for the men who wrote and received them, they were something larger, a quiet rebellion against erasure. Historians would later trace the psychological arc of German POWs in America. They found patterns, lower levels of violence, stronger social bonds inside camps, more stable reintegration into society after the war. Many of those patterns began, not with political speeches or official programs, but with ink and paper. A single sentence written in a distant kitchen could reach across an ocean and steady a man who thought he'd been forgotten. Years later, at kitchen tables across Germany, aging veterans told the same story again and again. It was the letters that kept us human. Of course, not every letter had carried good news. Some had delivered loss so sharp it left scars that never fully healed. Deaths in bombings, destroyed homes, families scattered like ash. But even those painful truths mattered. They anchored the men to reality, to a world outside the wire that still existed, even in ruins. They were not living in a void. They belonged to something, even if that something was fractured. Many of the surviving letters were kept in family boxes for decades. Some were pressed between the pages of photo albums. Others were passed down to children who asked, wide-eyed, what it was like to live behind fences and still feel the weight of home. For some, they became the only tangible proof that their fathers had not given up on the world, or on them. And there was something else, something no one had expected. The letters changed how many prisoners remembered their captors. They had been raised on images of enemies as monsters, ruthless, inhuman. But the Americans had let their words pass through unaltered. They hadn't twisted their messages into propaganda. They hadn't mocked their pain. They had simply let them write. For many, that single act cracked open everything they'd been taught. Some former prisoners, decades later, would speak at gatherings or write in their memoirs about the moment they first held those letters. They rarely spoke of battles. They rarely spoke of the crossing on Liberty ships. But the letters, those they remembered with clarity. The smell of the paper, the weight in their hands, the sudden rush of being tethered to something real. I stopped hating them the day I saw my mother's handwriting, one man admitted years later, his voice soft. I couldn't hate the people who let me have that. The power of those envelopes was quiet but enduring. They didn't end the war. They didn't erase pain. But they reminded men of who they were beneath the uniforms and the barbed wire. And that reminder changed everything. As the years wore on, the world moved forward. Barbed wire rusted. Barracks were torn down or reclaimed by fields. But in drawers and attic boxes the letters remained, yellowed with age, edges frayed, ink faded. And still, they carried the weight of the war's most unexpected mercy. Because in the end, the letters were never just paper. They were bridges, thin, fragile, but strong enough to span an ocean, a war, and a chasm of hatred. They were proof that even in the darkest chapter of history, words could keep a heartbeat alive.